The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.
CAF is a US-based non-profit organization that sponsors artists, scholars, and activists in our collective efforts to understand more deeply our fellow species and to further their rights. CAF, which was founded by Tom and Nancy Regan in 1985, gives each year grants to scholars and artists. We offer an annual fellowship to conduct research at the Animal Rights Archives at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, where Tom taught philosophy for 34 years. Since 2021, we've presented the Nancy Regan Arts Prize. And this year we launched Martin's Act at 200, an audio documentary that reflects on 200 years of animal advocacy since the passage of the first animal welfare legislation from a modern deliberative body. And that was the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act, sponsored by the Irish member of the British Parliament, Richard Martin. The CAF program that brings us here today is an annual lecture named after the late Tom Regan, who died 5 years ago, and who many of you know as the author of The Case for Animal Rights, the pioneering work of animal rights philosophy, which was published, scarcely possible to believe this, almost 40 years ago in 1983. I would like to take this opportunity at this moment to honor the life and work of legal scholar Sherry Kolb, who presented the 2019 Regan Memorial Lecture at the Rocky Mountain Ethics Conference in Boulder, Colorado, and whom many of you may know passed away a few months ago. Her contributions to legal scholarship and animal rights were significant, and her loss is a major one for both scholarship and the animal advocacy movement. And we are thinking of her and, of course, her family today. The lecture you'll be hearing today is the second Regan lecture that we've hosted this year as we catch up after 2 years of unavoidable challenges of holding in-person lectures during the pandemic. The first, on the Martin's Act, was given by Kim Stallwood in July and was co-sponsored by the UK Centre for Animal Law. And I'd like to thank Kim for all of his work in making this lecture come about. So you can read and listen and watch our lectures by visiting our website, cultureanimals.org. And at the website, you can also sign up for our newsletter, read about our programs and grantees going back 14 years, and learn about how to apply for our grants yourself. And at this point, I'd like to thank all the folks at Recht, particularly Vanessa Gerritsen, Moina Zeller, and Simon Bachman, for their enthusiasm and for help organizing this lecture, which took quite a lot of effort. So Charlotte will then speak for 40 to 45 minutes, after which Professor Will Kymlicka will respond. And then I'll moderate some of the questions that you will be asking. So about our speakers today. Charlotte Blattner is a senior lecturer and researcher at the Faculty of Law, Institute of Public Law at the University of Berne, Switzerland, specializing in climate law, animal law, and environmental law. Dr. Blattner holds a doctoral degree in international law and animal law from the University of Basel, Switzerland, and an LLM from Harvard Law School. Alongside numerous articles in animal law, she is the author of Protecting Animals Within and Across Borders, Extraterritorial Jurisdiction and the Challenges of Globalization, published by Oxford University Press in 2019. She was also the editor with Kendra Coulter and Will Kymlicka of the volume Animal Labor, A New Frontier of Interspecies Justice, ? Also published by OUP in 2019. For her outstanding work in animal law, Charlotte received the renowned Marie Heim-Wörtlin Prize in 2020 from the Swiss National Science Foundation. Will Kymlicka is the Canada Research Chair in Political Philosophy at Queen's University in Kingston, Canada, where he has taught since 1998. He has published 8 books and over 200 articles and has honorary doctorates from the University of Copenhagen, KU Leuven, in 2014. He received the 2019 Gold Medal from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the 2021 Pierre Chauveau Medal from the Royal Society of Canada. He is perhaps best known for the book Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights, which he wrote with Sue Donaldson, and which was published by OUP in 2011. So those are the speakers, and welcome again. And so without more ado, let me welcome Katerina Stoykova to talk about our co-hosts, Theorem Recht.
How am I doing? Can everybody hear me?
Yes?
Okay, good. Hi, thank you. My name is Katerina Stoykova. I'm a legal employee at Theorem Recht, the co-hosts of our today's event. And I'd like to give you a brief overview of Thier's work before handing over to Charlotte. Theorem Recht means Foundation for the Animal in Law in English. So as the name suggests, our work focuses on the legal aspects of animal protection. Thier was established in 1995 and is a fully independent nonprofit organization that depends entirely on donations. One of our main goals is to eliminate deficiencies in the Swiss animal welfare legislation by providing the necessary scientific basis and to ensure the consistent application and enforcement of existing laws. To this end, we campaign on a political and public level by working closely with politicians and developing practical suggestions for legislative change. We also offer educational and further training courses for animal owners, with authorities such as law enforcement and other organizations and educational institutions. We also offer internships for law and other students and graduates in the hopes of sparking enthusiasm for animal protection and law. Furthermore, we regularly publish legal reference books and expert opinions, as well as informational brochures and articles regarding the proper treatment of animals and the relating legal basis. We have a publication series with monographs, expert opinions, and scientific papers on legal and ethical aspects of the human-animal relationship accessible to a broad public. With the individual volumes, we hope to contribute to the promotion of scientific discourse and offer academics, students, practitioners, and enforcement a comprehensive source of information on animal welfare law and ethics. Right now, we are in our foundation library, which contains more than 21,000 publications. Not all of them are here in this room, but a big part is. And these publications are on animals in law, ethics, and society. And we're proud to say that we're the largest literary collection on the human-animal relationship in the German-speaking area. Also, we have a legal advice service for anyone seeking answers to legal questions concerning animals. However, we cannot litigate on their behalf because animals are not fully recognized as legal subjects in Swiss law. I could go on forever about what we do here, but this should give you some idea of our work exactly, and there's more information online on our website. So without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Charlotte Blattner, and I'm very much looking forward to this lecture. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kate. It's wonderful, and I'm sure people around the world appreciate knowing more about Thier's work, and also you guys becoming ever more international, and hopefully scholars from around the world joining you and using your library resources. I also, for the sake of this being mostly an online lecture today as well, just want to make sure that you can hear me. Can you give me a thumbs up, Martin? Okay, excellent. Thanks so much. So again, also thank you from my side, Martin, for the kind introduction and thoughtful words. And many thanks also from me to Vanessa Gerritsen, Simon Bachmann, Kate Stoykova, and all the people at Thier working behind the curtains to make this event work. I am deeply grateful to Martin and the entire Culture and Animals Foundation for inviting me to deliver the, I believe, 5th Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. As a relatively young scholar, this is a profound honor. The Case of Animal Rights was a bold book for its time. and one that almost 40 years after its publication still lays at the intellectual foundation of the animal ethics and studies community. It's a book I'm sure required courage and strength, sturdiness and dedication to write and defend. Tom Regan's writing speaks volumes about his respect, the deep respect that he cultivated towards animals. And all of these things, like his knowledge and skills, are gifts that young scholars today still profit from. So in this sense, I want to say thank you as well. And before I begin, I want to seize this moment and express my sincere gratitude to Will Kymlicka for responding to this lecture. Thank you for your continuous interest in this topic, for sharing your incredibly sharp mind with us, and for your unwavering dedication to building a more just world with other animals. So let me start by sharing my slides as well. Would be a good thing to do. So in the next 45 minutes or so, I will argue for a theory of transitional justice to be applied to human-animal relationships. Transitional justice is a discrete field of academic inquiry and political practice. It addresses past wrongs, such as war, large-scale human rights violations, to usher in a more peaceful and functioning society. And I apply this lens to our relations with animals to see if it can help us acknowledge the vast atrocities that we have done and still do to other animals and move toward more just relationships with them. So this is a topic I've been working on for a while, so I could talk about this for several hours too, but naturally I feel like I can only scratch the surface. Here are 4 elements I want us to focus on today. First, we're going to look at the state of animal law. I think there's different ways of reading what's going on today, and so that has an effect of what normative solutions we propose. The second thing we're going to look at is, in broad brush, look at what the demands from political theory are and why we need a transitional interspecies justice theory. Third, we're going to delve more into like the material content of that. So we look at the role, scope, and depth of transitional interspecies justice. And finally, an issue that I think is relevant as well is the question of timing. So I actually believe that the Martens Act 200-year anniversary can be a great learning moment for us. Martin mentioned it. It's a law that is also known as the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act. Is everything all right? Okay. Yeah. And it became widely known as one of the first laws to determine that one cannot do to other animals as one pleases. Cruel and improper treatment of cows, sheep, horses, for example, were prohibited from that day onwards. And here in the middle, you can actually see a painting of the trial of Bill Burns. This is the first conviction under the Martens Act that has taken place after Burns was found beating his donkey. And this case actually became memorable as well because Martin brought the donkey into court himself. Now, the enactment of the Martens Act was disruptive, in a sense, even revolutionary and radical, like given the broader socioeconomic and political environment of that time. The 1820s saw the rise of the Industrial Revolution. We've seen technological advances such as rail transport and the rise of the textile industry. Meanwhile, voting rights were scarce and elites ruled politics. We saw European colonialism began gaining ground in Africa and Asia, which resulted in wars as affected people opposed the exploitation and oppression. So the world was in a deeply transformative stage and preoccupied with matters relative to which concern for animals seemed trivial. Now, to be clear, the Martens Act was limited in scope. It wasn't like it was the remedy for the world's problems for animals in a sense. First, it only protected a few animals. So you can see it was cows, oxen, horses, mules, and sheep, but it was not concerned with many other animals that people used at the time. That could be birds, pigs, or chicken. Indeed, actually, Martin himself liked to shoot birds. So that's an expression of that. Second, these animals were not protected from cruel treatment or suffering too cruel. So customary use of animals to work them for labor, to use them in slaughterhouses, kill them for food and clothes production was still widely deemed acceptable and legal at the time. And third, together with other aristocrats, Martin actually wanted to see the practices of the urban working class to be targeted by this act. So that would be dog fighting or bear baiting, for example. The aristocrats' own practices, by contrast, like horse racing, fox hunting, shooting, and fishing, were framed as sports that should remain unregulated. Now, you can imagine since the 1820s, apart from the technological advances that we made, of course, we've also made significant progress when it comes to protecting other animals. And I tried to condense this, if that's ever possible, to like 4 statements, which I think are really interesting. So first of all, most countries worldwide have enforced laws that protect animals. It's not self-given, but that's the state that we're at. And almost all of them subscribe to the principle of unnecessary animal suffering, so animals should not suffer unnecessarily. In addition to administrative measures, some jurisdictions also hold people criminally responsible, even by imprisonment. And there are even constitutional provisions that determine, for example, that protecting animals is a state objective, or that require that animals be treated with compassion, or that determine that animals have dignity. In recent years, we've also witnessed a range of reforms across civil and common law jurisdiction that determine once and for all that animals are not objects, but indeed sentient beings. So, prompted in part by the Martins Act, we could argue that there is ongoing progress in law toward more comprehensively respecting non-human animals' interests. And many confirm this trend. If you look at this Animal Protection Index by the NGO WAP, World Animal Protection, and from this illustration, you can see that while many countries have a long way to go, the ones in red, there are actually few ones, especially those in green, that take on a leading role. And so for scholars like us, the question emerges, are we therefore at the finishing line of our societal progress to fully respecting animals' interests? Do we have a clear, reliable, and just roadmap in hand that we can just, implement and know this is going the right way? Yeah, you're looking skeptical. I also believe we don't. The law is a quintessential site at which our cultural and ethical views about animals manifest, and through which we yield power over them. Now, ideally, such power is legitimate and benevolent, and I think many of our animal laws actually, at least implicitly, claim to do so. But as Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka argue, most of our dealings with animals are manifestations of blanket power. They're an illegitimate form of oppression and often amount to a form of tyranny. Some might consider this a provocative argument, so let's take a closer look at by comparing the current state of animal law with what was put forward by Martin some 200 years ago. I would say let's first look at the scope of current animal laws. The most blatant example in this respect probably is the situation in the United States. There's a federal Animal Welfare Act, but it does not apply to farmed animals, most of the animals that are domesticated. There's a 28-hour law, and this actually seeks to protect animals during transport, but it does not apply to transport on truck, on the train, on truck, in the air, or on water. And these are most of the ways that farmed animals are being transported. There's the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, which requires farmed animals to be rendered insensible prior to slaughter, and it does not apply to chickens or fishes, those animals that are being mostly used in the farmed animal context. Similarly, there are many laws that govern our use of animals in research, and they do not apply to mice or fishes, again, those animals that we use most in that context. On a state level, that there are a number of anti-cruelty statutes that actually exempt from purview common farm practices. So everything that the farming industry usually does to animals is not being covered legally. In addition, there are laws that actually explicitly protect the industry, such as ag laws or veggie libel laws. We also have a whole range of exemptions in environmental law, but also in labor and employment law. So in a sense, we could say, well, maybe those are just the countries in red. How about the green ones? They're doing good. Well, I think even those in green, the situation is no better in this respect in those countries. Today, across the world, we killed more than 70 billion land animals per year for food production. It's just land animals, right? And that equates to more than 8 million individuals killed every single hour. Now, most of these animals, until they're being brought to the slaughterhouse, they live a life in misery. They're mutilated to conform systems of production. They're encaged and disabled from turning around. They're forcefully separated from their families and bereft of any opportunities to form their own relationships. We keep domesticated animals most of their lives captive and deny them leading a life according to their own scripts. So according to their own views about what is good sleep, tasty food, meaningful relationships, how it is to experience fun, humor, play, and explore your own interests. Now, operating under the banner of Animal Protection Acts, the laws of most states, and that includes the green ones, obfuscate this everyday violence that we wage against animals precisely through the principle of unnecessary animal suffering. So necessity, that is something that we define by human use alone. So little of what we actually do to animals is actually really necessary. We do it for profit, we do it for convenience, we do it for out of a habit because of ignorance. There are many such factors, but it's not strictly necessary in that sense. At least in the sense that we usually use the term necessity in a legal context. For these practices, the law actually provides a normative safeguard to secure anthropocentric interests on a systemic scale. These laws primarily serve us by legitimating or protecting our use of animals, rather than actually protecting animals, which should be the mandate of animal law. Now, what's important to understand is that animals do not experience the above-mentioned harms by happenstance. Billions of animals are being mistreated in self-evident manner, day in and day out, without requiring any justification. And this is a form of routinized violence that emerges from social domination. This violence is structural, meaning that it is constitutive of our socioeconomic system. Finally, the violence that we commit against other animals is institutionalized. So it's embedded in structures of authority, the nation state, and the power that is derived from it, such as the law. Now, let us turn to the third point where we can compare the Martens Act to today's progress, and that is the religious, racial, cultural, class imperialism axis. Looking at the Martens Act, we saw that some of the earliest traces of legalized welfarism as imperialism. And we actually still practice this today. Jewish and Islamic communities are condemned for ritual slaughter. African Americans are punished for dogfighting. Native peoples are condemned for hunting seals or whales. By contrast, whatever majoritarian practices are, such as farming animals, slaughtering them, or doing research with them, is considered customary, natural, familiar, and necessary. Now, what's important to understand is that such practices often cause just as much suffering in animals, often in exponentially bigger numbers, but they're left unchecked by the law. Often they're also insulated by the law. And now looking at these dynamics from a bird's eye perspective, we could say that, well, progress in animal law in the last 200 years, question mark, it's something that we have to ask ourselves. Has the violence really stopped towards animals, or is it indeed the fact that it shows no sign of slowing down? Now, these practices, they have been criticized by abolitionists for a very long time. Tom Regan spearheaded this movement by arguing that subjects of a life have a right not to be used as a means to others' ends, and that this right ought not to be sacrificed, even if the consequences of that might be appealing, because we're used to exploiting animals and we profit from it. Now, most contemporary theories of justice actually support this argument, but they criticize one strand of abolitionism, namely that domesticated animals should go gradually extinct. They argued that just as in the case of historical wrong done to humans, we cannot undo wrong done to victims by simply removing them. And that would just be a new form of injustice that we create. So a central argument behind this political turn in animal ethics is that we should instead acknowledge that animals have a claim to continued existence, inclusion, membership, and participation. More specifically, animals have a right to be here, to form their own relationships, to live life according to their own scripts, and to have a formation in all of the aspects that shape their lives, be it on the micro level or on the macro level. Now, these rights are owed to animals not as a matter of charity, so guidance that we can just ignore whenever we want to, but as a matter of justice, so as rights that are inalienable and justiciable. In summary, we're faced with new claims from political theory for establishing a shared interspecies society as a matter of justice. Now, these theories are distinctively forward-looking, so they explore future possibilities of peaceful and respectful coexistence between humans and animals. What they do not do, on the other hand, is that they focus on the past. And this lack of attention to backward-looking justice is intentional and it's explicit. So scholars claim that animals do, in fact, they lack the historical memories that would generate the need for backward-looking theories of justice, like retaliatory or reparatory justice. Claire Palmer, for example, argues, and I quote, "Animals cannot gain psychologically from knowing that reparation is reparation. Anything like an apology or a memorialization would be wasted on them. They lack concepts of justice, bear no grudges against either perpetrators or beneficiaries, and seek no satisfaction from either." Unquote. So efforts to restore our relationships with them, to address the harm that we've done to them, to punish past wrong, etc., would just be lost on animals. However, this position and the arguments behind it and the evidence put forward in support of it are increasingly gaining criticism. And there's a lot of interesting new research done with rather than on animals, that especially in sanctuary setting, that explores animals' own ways of living and being. Among others, this research shows that animals have elaborate emotions in response to trauma and a desire for reconciliation. And I will focus on these two, but there's a range of emotions that are really relevant for triggering that kind of theory of justice as well. So animals experience a range of emotions. They have a capacity to remember past abuse, and they suffer extensively from trauma, or at least they have the capacity to. So elephants are usually documented to grieve for weeks, even years for their loved ones. They engage in burial rituals, and they're known to return to burial site of family members for years after. Other animals like gray-legged goose, sea lions, orcas, chimpanzees, or dolphins let their heads hang, they move slowly, and they show signs of depression after a traumatic event. There's some interesting research being done by Barbara King that actually shows that many of the animals that we usually just exploit for our purposes do experience such trauma and depression as well, and that is formerly farmed animals. And very interesting as well that these trauma can be inherited as we inherit trauma too, even if we as offspring of someone else have never experienced that trauma as well. So that's an element and dimension to consider in that respect too. Now, our relationships with animals are marked by high levels of cooperation, sociability, and solidarity. And this is why animals too have a desire for reconciliation, to forgive and to re-establish peaceful relationships with whomever they establish a community. So Frans de Waal was actually one of the first researchers to report that reconciliation was taking place among non-human primates. There's decades of research that followed showing that animals both initiate and reciprocate reconciliation. And they do so to reduce social tension, to limit aggression, to decrease the likelihood of escalation, and restore disrupted relationships. The means by which they do so is through affectionate behavior mostly. That could be embracing, cuddling, kissing, submissive vocalization, but also grooming and appeasement gestures. And acts of reconciliation and the need to reconcile can actually be expected in all group living animals. And again, that includes chickens and pigs and cows and many other animals whom we commercially exploit. Now, I believe we can infer several things from this. First, what we do to other animals on a daily basis, be it confinement, be it mutilation or separation from their kin, it's something that we cannot easily shrug off as these are just animals who we can seriously mistreat in one moment and then treat justly the next. Second, without reconciliation, animals cannot return to a state of normalcy and peace. They undergo various stresses during and after conflict, and they engage in various practices of peacemaking. And this suggests that in relation to humans too, they will look for forms of reconciliation. In this sense, there is a strong presumption that animals too would benefit from backward-looking mechanisms of justice. Now, I believe, I'm just going to quickly cover that, but I believe we have some quite selfish reason too for considering these claims of animals. Now, as you heard me speak, our language, of course, I'm adapting that to what we usually use, but our language is used to firmly differentiating between humans and animals. On this basis, we socially and culturally construct animals as others, and by othering them, we often use this as an opportunity to justify maltreatment and injustice toward them. And this category, the animal category, is one that we keep wide open to also relegate humans to. So just a few examples: in Nazi speeches, Jews were called vermin and rats. The Hutus called the Tutsis cockroaches. And in similar fashion, former US President Donald Trump referred to migrants as animals. Now, such boundary work is not just an inappropriate rhetoric that sits unwell with affected people. The methods used to subjugate, exclude, exploit, and even murder these humans are directly taken from means to exploit and oppress animals. And research shows that these oppressions actually operate in an intersectional and mutually reinforcing way. So the more we believe that humans must be differentiated from animals, the more we dehumanize human groups that do not conform the hegemonic norm. And because of these interlocking connections, as long as we continue categorically differentiating animals from humans and thinking that they're outside our ethical equations, we will not succeed at achieving an indiscriminatory just system, even just for humans alone. So ensuring peaceful and lasting relationships among humans necessitates that animals be firmly included in this plight. And this includes in the plight of how to grapple with our past. Now, a few scholars have in recent years begun to add backward-looking dimensions to animals' claim to justice. They look to the literature on memory and reconciliation after violence and atrocity to make the argument that moral repair and restorative efforts must occur before we can expect that claims for just interspecies community are being heard. Guy Scotton, in this sense, asks, and I quote, "What would it mean for a society to truly begin to acknowledge the atrocities it has committed against non-human animals? What would it mean to truly be sorry individually and collectively for interspecies evils?" Unquote. Now, thanks to political multi-species ethnography, which is often done in sanctuary settings, we have a progressively clearer image of how this world could take shape. However, sanctuaries are often mini islands of interspecies justice, if you will, in a larger world of structural violence against other animals. And forms of interspecies justice can, of course, be actively promoted in sanctuary settings. However, ways to basically reform an entire socioeconomic and political system that still profits from the exploitation of animals have yet to be explored. So the argument here basically is that the political turn in animal ethics has not yet paid sufficient attention to the suggestion that potentially also between humans and animals, the past must first be acknowledged, relationships repaired, and reconciliation inaugurated before just relations may take over the violent present. So we cannot just simply and quickly move toward just relations without actually addressing the past. In short, we need a transitional theory of interspecies justice. As I argue in the next minute, I think transitional justice can be seen as a response to this lack of a plan for a transition that we have. It can operate as a bridge between the law and political theory. It can operate as a bridge between the is and the oughts, and now and the then. It can help societies see wrong, envision alternative forms of being with other animals, and then also, of course, transitioning toward them. To make my case, we will now take a closer look at the role, scope, and depth of transitional interspecies justice. Just a few basics on transitional justice, because it's not a concept that everyone might be familiar with. Transitional justice is the process that is usually employed in the aftermath of periods of acute conflict and repression, or of large-scale human rights violations. Think of World War II, armed conflict, the Rwandan genocide, the enforced disappearances across Southern American countries, or systematic acts of sexual violence committed against women during war. Given the massive scale of these violations and the breadth of government involvement, there's an agreement that such crimes cannot be addressed by the normal justice system. And there are several reasons for this. For example, many of the crimes that were committed during those times were so grave that no punishment ever seems adequate to undo this wrong. In other situations, there might be punitive measures available, but actually holding perpetrators responsible for the acts that they committed would mean that a majority of people will go to prison, which effectively renders a post-conflict state ungovernable. And third, institutional reforms that one could initiate to correct past wrong and inaugurate a new regime could actually create new injustices for affected people. So in response to these and other critical historical moments, transitional justice has emerged. The United Nations defines it as, and I quote, the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempt to come to terms with a legacy of large-scale past abuses in order to ensure accountability, serve justice, and achieve reconciliation, unquote. Now, the scheme to the left actually illustrates that the mechanisms of transitional justice are numerous and multifaceted, and they encompass legal, quasi-legal, and non-judicial means. Think of prosecutions, reparations, truth-seeking, institutional reforms, vetting, but also dismissal or a combination thereof. And all of this can happen with differing level of involvement on the by international actors like the United Nations, or none at all. In its broadest sense, transitional justice is argued to be a methodology for social transformation. It is a mechanism or process through which we move from war, conflict, hostile relations, institutional violence, and other systematic wrong to peace, to observance of rights, to collective trust, reconciliation, and potentially even democracy. And this is where this concept operates as a bridge between the present and the future. Now, looking at human-animal relations, we can envisage a similar departure from the status quo through transitional justice. The mechanism could be employed to acknowledge wrong done to animals, to prevent future violations of their interests, to assist reconciliation in interspecies community, or even to contribute to building a shared interspecies society. So imagine animals' resistance to what we do to them was being heard. Their screams, their shrieks, their fight, flight, freeze responses in slaughterhouses and research facilities, etc. And the community decided to build a truth commission or reconciliation commission. Or imagine the current request at the International Criminal Court to recognize ecocide as the fifth crime under the Rome Statute was successful. This would give rise to new forms of accountability that are international and judicial, but also which are employed vis-a-vis animals. Now, before we begin embarking on such visions of transitional justice, I want to address two likely objections. The first objection is that transitional justice is usually said to be overly anecdotal, to spur unrealistic hopes for a happy ending. And the same danger actually lures in our case. So we could say, well, like unrecognized victims of war, such as women, we now begin to recognize certain animal victims as proper victims of war. Think about dogs or horses that have served in war. And this would be a step forward. However, I think there's much more transformative potential that this lens of transitional justice carries. And so we'll look at these dimensions in a minute. The second objection is that it actually concerns the question of time. So in the above mentioned cases where conflict has come to an end, all of this happened in the past. And when you employ transitional justice, conflict, acts of aggression, violence, etc., has stopped. But in our case, the systematic violence that we do unto animals has not stopped. Indeed, as we sit or stand here today or on our computers at home, whichever it is, at this point, we still wage violence against other animals everywhere around us. So the question here emerges, what are we to make of these different starting positions? Now, I'll start with the first objection and then move to the second. Transitional justice in its earliest form was long criticized for its exclusive focus on a violation of a narrow set of civil and political rights. In doing so, it was criticized for failing to consider the experience of women, minorities, children, nature as well, and that in, during, and after conflict. So it's not just about who's a victim, but also how is conflict defined, and when and how are its ends and beginnings defined. So, for example, during World War II, an estimated 410,000 women were kidnapped and raped by the Japanese Imperial Army. The women were euphemistically called comfort women, and acts against them remained unrecognized by the United Nations, even when it looked into the liability of Japan. Ever since, and some more historical examples that play a role here, victims, politicians, academics, and practitioners have called on transitional justice to respond to the claims of women. And this call for inclusion goes beyond just demanding the recognition of non-archetypal actors as victims of war. So, for example, when conflict officially stopped, violence often continued to be exerted against women. So rape, for example, continued even as conflict officially stopped. And when women were recognized as victims of these atrocities, they were exclusively seen as such. They hardly came to share the successes of political governance, even when they, for example, contributed to ousting authoritarianism. By maintaining such a narrow vision on transitional justice, the argument is that we risk only dealing with the symptoms of an injustice and not with its root causes. And that transitional justice has failed to attend to those deep-seated structural violence that still permeate our world is a fact that post-colonial critiques make clear as well. Accordingly, claims for transitional justice are now being formulated in relation to indigenous communities and descendants of former slaves. These critiques and demands have culminated in a call for transformation. And this is known as the fourth phase or fourth generation of transitional justice, which challenges us to think through thicker concepts of justice and injustices and ways to overcome them. In essence, so, transitional justice is not anymore just about rebuilding a fractured society, about returning to a peaceful status quo ante. It is not about restoring trust in society. Rather, because it's intended to respond to those deeper and pre-existing forms of violence, oppression, and exploitation, it is asked to build, mostly from scratch, the trust, to eradicate violence, domination, and oppression, to establish peace, and to create the conditions for a shared society to begin to emerge. And I believe if we envisage transitional justice in this thick form for animals, it carries significant transformative potential. We can acknowledge wrong done in a wholesome manner against animals. We can address the root causes of their oppression and subjugation. We can work toward their full inclusion in a shared society. For example, and I'm just going to give a few here, we could establish truth commissions that could document the scale of violence that we have been inflicted on animals. We could uncover the breadth of government's involvement, and we could meaningfully try to communicate to the public how these atrocities affect animals. Now, to be clear, truth commissions, they usually lack the power to attach legal consequences to the violations that they document, but there usually are a first crucial means to establish a minimum consensus of what happened in the past, and that's really important. The second pillar, many consider punishment to be the adequate response to violations or wrongdoing in a broader sense, including to prevent new atrocities from happening. However, punishment in transitions really raises some intriguing questions. So how are we to deal with crime that were legal at the time that they were committed? How do we not unduly punish already disadvantaged individuals or groups and instead succeed at grasping collective wrong? What role also, and Kate mentioned that in her introduction, what role should animals play in criminal trials? As I argue, I think we should acknowledge and recognize animals as proper victims of crime with their own standing in criminal procedure, and that includes giving them victim rights, which includes the right to representation. Now, after an oppressive regime has reigned, holding just a few people accountable usually makes no sense at all. How can we expect the very same regime that has permitted or even demanded large-scale violence against animals to take place to suddenly help rebuild a shared interspecies community? In those situations, transitional justice usually calls for broader reforms. Lustration and vetting, for example, are used to ensure that institutional mechanisms and processes do not hinder progress. Another central question is whether reparations are owed to victims, and calling for reparations on behalf of animals might seem like a stretch to many people, but I think it's important to understand that, like many wronged humans, animals leave a site of conflict as beings who were taken away from their family members, who have been disabled by the industry, who lack a home, access to veterinary care, and who often cannot survive in a human-centered world. And it's also important to understand that reparations do not just include monetary recompense, but they also include material reparations, symbolic or legal ones. So consider, for example, land being given back to animals, or their liberty being restored, or basic rights being established for them. And here you can see how transitional justice, in fact, deals with this rupture between the is and the ought, and how it can help set up rights, which philosophers like Tom Regan have demanded for so long. In relation to reparations, I think it's really interesting to talk about how far back in time we should go, who must pay reparations to whom, and how those should be done vis-a-vis animals. As part of this broader reconciliatory effort to inaugurate more just relations with animals, we should also explore therapeutic services, apologies, and forgiveness and reconciliation with other animals. And in this pillar, I want to focus on two things for this lecture. First, in addition to being acknowledged as victims, animals can and should be recognized as important agents in transition processes. genuine reconciliatory efforts require that we offer an animals an opportunity to engage in reconstruction, that they be part of us, like a solid part of society that is co-constituted. And this requires that we create awareness for our mutual social normativity that we share, that we establish and reaffirm the common norms that we have, or also that we adequately respond to violations of those norms. The second point in this pillar I want to mention is that there's a common trope in transitional justice discussions, namely that we have a duty to remember. And in our case, there's a huge danger that we simply brush over the atrocities done to other animals and their ongoing effects on their lives. So efforts to remember the past are really critical to seal the past and begin healing broken bonds. And there's some fascinating new research done on new forms of interspecies remembering, such as inclusive cemeteries, memorials, programs for education, and art and play. And I think a beautiful example here is Gilly and Mark's Memorial Wild Table of Togetherness that was just set up in London earlier this year in July. Now, let us move to the issue of timing. As I mentioned, transitional justice is designed to help a shattered society, former antagonists or opponents, or groups that have never even lived together, to come together peacefully and to come to terms with the past and establish a new common and peaceful future. So these mechanisms of transitional justice, they seem to depend on one condition, that conflict has ended. And so this grand scheme of developing a transitional theory of interspecies justice, shall we just place it in our bookshelves and wait for governments to stop financing violence against animals, for slaughterhouse workers to put down their weapons, for research committees to stop whitewashing torture against animals? In transitional justice, the dilemma of ongoing conflict and the need for it to end is not new. And this has given rise to its prefigurative application. The most prominent example in this regard is the Russell Tribunal. It was established during the Vietnam War to prevent the crime of silence. So it did normal penal process procedures that it went through. So they did fact-finding trips, they heard witnesses, they wrote defendants and gathered testimonies, documents, and photographs. In its final report, the tribunal found that the US had committed acts of aggression against Vietnam and violated its sovereignty. Now, what's really interesting to understand is the tribunal actually lacked authorization by any state or an international body. As Jean-Paul Sartre, who is also part of the tribunal, explains, and I quote, "We are simply going to hold hearings in a case which should in the ordinary way come before an international tribunal which does not exist," unquote. So the tribunal challenged who counts as a victim and who does not, what law means and when it is applied and when it is not. The source of its legitimacy was the people who had a right to set up their own tribunals when their governments had forgotten or disenfranchised them. And by using this tribunal prematurely in this prefigurative sense, Russell and his colleagues actually established transitional justice avant la lettre, a precursor of transitional justice. Now, since the Russell Tribunal, there's a whole range of people's tribunals that have grown in prominence and are now seen as an effective means of social movements. Modern applications include, for example, the ecocide mock trial that was held in September 2011 at the UK Supreme Court with its own public jury and judges, lawyers, fossil fuel representatives, and spokespersons for birds who were damaged by ecocide. Now, I believe corresponding counterparts could be established today as a model of an alternative accountability mechanism to contribute to ending the violence against animals. We could set up a tribunal to investigate and tell the truth, to make visible the magnitude of past and ongoing injustices done to animals. By examining the past comprehensively, tribunals could analyze not just individual responsibility, but also corporate behavior that is wedded to the atrocities we do to animals and government involvement in producing and reproducing them. Finally, by recommending reforms, reparations, means of reconciliation and remembering, tribunals could give the public around the globe a glimpse into an alternative, a more just world, not just for other animals, but with other animals. And with this, I want to end this lecture today. Thank you so much for your kind attention, and I'm really excited to listen to Will's response.
Well, thank you so much, Charlotte. That was fascinating and a huge amount to unpack there. So without more ado, Will, I'll hand it over to you for your response.
Thank you, Martin, for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of the Regan Lecture Series, and it's a particular pleasure to be commenting on today's lecture by Charlotte, who I think is doing some of the most interesting and innovative work on animal rights, as this lecture today indicated. So I basically agree with everything Charlotte argued, which I might recap this way, that we live in a society that's kind of built on the systematic violence against animals, and that what we call animal protection laws are in fact laws that justify and legitimize that violence against animals, and that genuine interspecies justice requires renouncing that violence. So there's growing evidence, as Charlotte suggests, that any commitment to renounce violence is not likely to endure or be effective if it's not accompanied by some reckoning with the past. And so we need to engage in practices of commemoration, apologies, memorialization, truth-telling, and rectification, compensation, if this transition to nonviolence is to be stable. So as Charlotte mentioned, some people think that in the animal case, this reckoning with the past is not necessary because animals allegedly lack the kind of psychologies, like the memories, that would make it meaningful to have apologies or memorials. But I think Charlotte is completely right that social animals have their own practices of moral repair, we might say, so that social animals have and need practices of reconciliation in the case where wrongs have happened, and this has been studied by a wide range of ethologists. And so we can learn from animals' own practices of reconciliation. And this points to one of the things that I actually most like about Charlotte's work generally, that she doesn't view animals as just the passive victims of human injustice, but also as agents who have their own lives to lead, from which we can learn. And so we should view animals as agents and teachers, not just as passive victims. So animals need some forms of reconciliation to deal with trauma, but also the humans involved need to go through some process of transitional justice, that we're not going to have a stable transition if we don't transform our subjectivities. And that requires that we actually engage in these processes of acknowledging the history of human-animal injustice through some form of things like truth and reconciliation. Okay, so that's Charlotte's argument, and as I say, I completely agree, and I think this is an exciting and important addition to the way we think about animal rights. So I just have a couple of questions about how to push this project forward. So one comment is about this idea of people's tribunals, which Charlotte suggests as being a first step. So I think it's a kind of brilliant strategy, a brilliant tactic for raising these issues in a public platform. But it's just worth noting, I think, that it's not really transitional justice, not just because the violence hasn't stopped, but also because it doesn't really do one of the things that transitional justice is supposed to do, which is bring perpetrators and victims together. So in at least some versions of these people's tribunals, it's essentially, advocates and activists compiling information in order to help publicize certain kinds of injustice, but the perpetrators aren't involved. So for example, the corporate interests might not agree to participate in the people's tribunals. And similarly, the animals are not necessarily participating. And so we might think of this People's Tribunal as, I mean, it's a kind of transitional justice about animals, but it's not transitional justice with animals. And I think one of the most exciting parts of Charlotte's proposal is we try to think seriously about what it would mean to engage in transitional justice with animals and not just about animals. So if we try to think about that, which I think is really a challenging task, what would it mean to do transitional justice with animals and not just about animals? In my own work with Sue Donaldson, we found it helpful to distinguish the case of domesticated animals from wild animals, because I think they actually do differ with respect to transitional justice. So think about wild animals, free-living wild animals. So one example we might think of as a group of wild animals who are owed transitional justice, think about wolves. So in many parts of the world, including where I live, wolves were basically hunted to extinction. And so we surely have an obligation to engage in some truth-telling about that, and I think to commemorate it and to memorialize it. And there may be duties of rectification and compensation in terms of habitat. But I'm not sure that the goal should be to communicate to wolves that we have renounced this violence against them, and in the goal of trying to establish trust with wolves. So Charlotte emphasized one of the goals of transitional justice typically is to either restore trust or to create trust. But I actually think in many cases in our relations with wild animals, a healthy degree of mistrust is a good thing. I actually think it would could create more conflicts if wolves came to trust that we were not going to harm them. It would actually make it more likely that they would, possibly prey on companion animals or on farmed animals. And so one consequence of that history of violence is they've learned to distrust humans. But I actually think that might be a good thing, and that in relation to many wild animals, we're less likely to have conflicts, including the conflicts that generate calls for violence, if there's mistrust on both sides. So we don't really trust the intentions of wolves. Wolves don't really trust our intentions. So we try to avoid each other. And that kind of avoidance is, I think, often good for just relations with wild animals. So in a paradoxical way, I think mistrust is a condition, can sometimes be a condition of justice, particularly in our relations with wild animals. So we should renounce violence, but I'm not sure that we should be, that the goal should be to ensure that wolves trust us not to engage in violence. That may actually make things worse. By contrast, if you think about domesticated animals, it seems clear that this is transitional justice we can do with animals. So in the case of wolves, I think we want transitional justice about them, but not necessarily with them. In the case of domesticated animals, I think we should be thinking about what would be forms of transitional justice with the animals themselves. And in the case of domesticated animals, one of the great injustices we've done is precisely around trust. We inculcate trust, we encourage domesticated animals to trust us, and then we betray that trust. So we get animals in labs to trust the humans, and then the humans use that trust to then make it easier to experiment on them or harm them. And so too, farmers get domesticated animals to trust them, and then they use that trust to make it easier to transport them to slaughter. And so that's a betrayal of trust. And I think in this case, we have a clear moral obligation to repair that kind of betrayal. And so I think that domesticated animals often do really need an interspecies form of transitional justice that does have the goal of repairing a broken relationship, repairing broken trust. But I think I can see clearly, I think, how we might have forms of transitional justice with domesticated animals, more so than with wild animals. But even in this case, I think there's an interesting complication that for the domesticated animals, I think the kind of transitional justice that will be meaningful to them is likely to be quite local, interpersonal. It's about a kind of face-to-face relationships. That's the kind of reconciliation that's going to be most meaningful to domesticated animals, is reconciliation with the specific human beings with whom they've had face-to-face relations. Whereas when we think about the political task of transitional justice in relation to humans, I think we often want to focus, as Charlotte herself emphasized at the beginning, on more systemic issues. We want to focus on the powerful corporate interests and government interests who have underpinned this system of exploitation. And I'm not sure that, so if we had like truth-telling commissions that were focused on trying to track the role of corporate elites and business elites in structuring animal exploitation, I don't think that kind of transitional justice is going to be necessarily very meaningful for domesticated animals. They need and want local interpersonal forms of transitional justice, whereas politically speaking, the humans involved, I think, are going to need forms of transitional justice that focus on more systemic and structural issues and actors. All of which is to say that I think they're interesting. While the goal of transitional justice is, as I say, I think it's a terrific and exciting and important part of the animal rights agenda, I think that the kinds of transitional justice, whether it's with animals or for animals, whether it's more local or more systematic, I think there'll be interesting variations. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to be a commentator. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
So Charlotte, would you like to respond to Will's comments?
If I'm allowed to, I would love to. Yeah. Thank you so much for these thoughtful remarks, Will. That's really most useful. Also to further think this through, because I think Martin mentioned it, we're spanning 3 countries with just the 3 of us right now, but there's many more people attending this lecture. And I think transitional justice will look vastly different in each of those countries, just like it has always looked different in the human case across jurisdictions and across cultural communities. A few things, totally agree on the wild animals, domesticated animals divide. I think there's, for me, the priority would be to look at the atrocities done to domesticated animals and to begin exploring what forms of transitional justice could look like in that respect. But I also think we should not neglect our relations with wild animals and what those could look like. If there's maybe a more watered down version of how to look at this, because I think acknowledgement of wrong is also relevant in that context, as you mentioned. Regarding the people's tribunals and whether or not they bring people, perpetrators and victims together, that again vastly differs. And I think it's important to attach the caveat to anything that I mentioned before, is that the success of any of such initiatives will depend so much on who is behind such a tribunal, in what jurisdiction is it being instantiated, what's this jurisdiction's past experience with transitional justice mechanisms, and so on. So one cannot say that this is a solution that fits for all jurisdictions. That's important to understand. So having perpetrators and victims in the room is not always the case. So especially there's victims movements who say we don't want our perpetrators to be in the same room as we are. Truth commissions have vast experience of how to deal with this. So there's a lot that we can learn in that respect. I also agree that local and interpersonal forms of interspecies justice can be successful in that respect. That's especially relevant not just for the animals themselves, but also for the human communities. And something I neglected in the next lecture, maybe too much, that it's not just animals that determine what the needs of a transitional justice mechanism is, but often also humans who were the perpetrators. So what learning lessons are necessary or not. For example, corporal punishment is something that might be necessary under a transitional justice mechanism, but for which animals themselves have no immediate need, right? That's something to keep in mind. We've had this discussion recently in Switzerland with the huge public vote that we had on factory farming. And turns out the main discussion was about whether factory farming was indeed taking place in Switzerland or not, which many people denied. So here's how you can see acknowledgement of wrong is really important. And each country will claim that all of the bad things that are happening outside its jurisdiction, but not within. Hence, local approaches are really important. But I want to emphasize that in addition to that, I really think it's important to keep an eye on these systemic violations and atrocities as well. We cannot, by any means, bring to court all perpetrators and victims of animal atrocities. Some animals might not want that. The sheer number of atrocities done to animals is just too big to actually institute transitional justice mechanisms and tribunals in each of those cases. So I think keeping that meta perspective with an eye to the systemic wrong being done is really important in that respect as well.
Will, would you like to respond to that?
Well, that all sounds great. I think on this, as on most issues, Charlotte and I really agree at the foundational level. Thanks.
So just to let you know, for those who haven't seen, the Q&A section is open for your questions, and we have a couple of questions at the moment. But I have a question that I thought that kept coming to my mind as you were talking, both of you. It's the role, perhaps, of those denizen species, those interstitial species between wild and domesticated that you and Sue Donaldson will talk about in Zoopolis, and whether they offer perhaps an interesting notion of a transition towards justice. For before there is peace, there must be some kind of reconciliation. And before there is reconciliation, there has to be that moment when hostilities cease. And one of those theories is coexistence theory, in which there is a cessation, the terms for the cessation of violence takes place. And as I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about the fact that climate change is going to stimulate the transition, the elimination of certain borders, not only for human beings as they move from countries that or areas that can no longer sustain them, but animals as well. And that in that process, including invasive species, moving as well, you're going to see a need for accommodation, simply because the numbers of species moving and the numbers of humans moving will require accommodation from the various quote unquote native species. So I was wondering if perhaps denizens could lead us to think about a forcing of a kind of accommodation, because there is no way for either group to survive if it maintains the notion of its own biological or national purity. And in that regard, how does animal resistance, the resistance that animals are showing by locating elsewhere or by breeding elsewhere or spawning further north, or in some cases refusing to be taken to slaughter, refusing to cooperate with the borderlands that are established by humans, how do those fit into a kind of liminal state to lead towards a reimagination of the agency of animals and therefore a different kind of transitional justice, perhaps?
Well, I think this one's for you. No?
Well, I think it's also for you, but I think the case of liminal animals is interesting. I mean, for the reasons you've mentioned, Barton, but also it raises this more general question about whether and to what extent different forms of transitional justice, what is the goal? So Charlotte in a couple places said that the goal is to appeal to and the kind of shared normativity, and so that at least some versions of transitional justice are trying to build on the fact that we can have shared normativity between humans and animals. And I think this is one of the interesting variations between domesticated animals, liminal animals, and wild animals, is precisely this question of whether we're looking for a form of coexistence that is based on shared normativity, or whether we're looking for forms of coexistence which actually do not rest on shared normativity. And I mean, and the liminal example of liminal animals is fascinating in this respect, because to some extent, since we share the same physical territory, I mean, the way Sue and I talk about liminal animals is that we share the same physical territory, but don't actually share a social world in the sense of a world that's built around shared norms. And so you could imagine trying to come up with a kind of typology of transitional justice one of the criteria by which we might categorize different forms of transitional justice is the extent to which they're built on ideas of shared norms, whether they're built on ideas of shared physical coexistence without shared sociality, and conversely, whether they're built on ideas of actually that we need to kind of separate ourselves from certain wild animals, both in terms of physical territory and sociality. And I think that would create a really interesting typology of different forms of transitional justice.
Charlotte, I would love to know what you thought about that question.
My brain is honestly still trying to wrap its head around how I would make this work and if it would be a good example or a too difficult one, because so many different levels come together, not just the theory, but also disciplines and time elements. It's something I definitely will take with me and continue thinking about, but it's not one I would say immediately, this seems like this should be our spearhead area where we push a transitional justice project forward.
All right, well, we have some questions now from our audience. So from Marine Lercier, if we take the example of certain classes of animals forced to work or farmed animals, transitional justice, especially in its intergenerational dimension, seems critical. Indeed, it seems to me that legal rights for animals in the form of redress gain one more indisputable foundation once society accepts the idea of documenting and examining the truth and taking responsibility for extending justice to the other animals with whom humans make society. So the question is intergenerational justice possible in the case of non-human animals, despite traditional objections to animal agency? Charlotte.
What's the likelihood of success of this project? That's a difficult question to assess, since I think when I did my research on transitional interspecies justice, and I mentioned it's a huge project right now, I look at all of these pillars that I looked at, remembrance, reconciliation, punishment, etc. I realized that there's so many manifestations in real life already. It's just not bringing together a coherent whole. So vigils, for example, or a prime example of how to document and witness the atrocities done to animals. There's some really interesting, good friend of mine in the US and now Toronto, she and her partner, they actually set up ways of how to commemorate animals and what they currently do to us from a future-oriented perspective. So they tried to imagine what would it be like. Imagine we're in 2050 right now and animal exploitation, especially of farmed animals, has stopped. And we look back, how would we set up a public memory of what we've done to these animals? Is there any statute that would do justice and be representative of these vast sufferings that these animals have gone through and still the standing that they deserve in our society today? And so there's really great instances of that. Working animals, and I know Marine has worked on animal labor as well. Working animals is a really interesting instance. I've never thought about merging the two kind of lenses of dealing with this human-animal conundrum, but it's an interesting one because in the case of working animals, there's been some really large-scale public acknowledgements of their past contributions to war, for example, or the fact that they've been suffering in war and have lost their lives. So this is usually a contribution that the state, the government, the army, etc., hugely values. It's not the case that this has yet translated into new rights and protections being set up for them by these actors ipso facto. By contrast, there had to be advocates representing the animals, such as, for example, people who wanted to bring the dogs that they work with in war back home, but were barred from doing so because the animals were still considered equipment. And so as they pushed for reforms, there's now ways to return these animals for more. And so this recognition is slowly moving toward creating standing and certain legal protections for animals, right? So that's really interesting. I think it's one avenue to look at this. I'm not quite sure if the working lens itself is vast enough to deal with the atrocities that we do unto other animals, because of course it depends on how we define working animals, etc. So the broader lens for transitional interspecies justice applied to any atrocities and evil done to animals, whether they be working animals or not, would be suitable in my opinion.
Okay, any comments, Will?
Well, just a quick, I very much like the idea of thinking about this in intergenerational terms. And I would just say that you know, when people look out at society, they often think of this as something humans built. And I think it's really important to reflect on the way in which indeed it's been the work of animals has also central to what we, you know, the societies we've built have been built by humans and animals together on vastly unfair and unjust terms, but and trying to find a way of thinking about the societies we live in as being something that's been built on the back of animal labor, I think is really important.
Great. Well, we have a question here from Tim Raisu. Hope I pronounced that correctly. Wouldn't reparations and commemorations also be necessary to prevent atrocities against animals from repeating itself again in a later stage? For example, because future generations forget about the injustices, ? Similar to how decreasingly commemorating World War II leads to the revival of anti-Semitism. And apparently Recht is going to answer that question. So maybe you don't need to respond to that question. Very quick question from Walter Osika. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Sorry for coming in late. Maybe you already have covered the process of ecocide, and if there are any similarities and differences with where the, quote, progressive animal law community transitional justice, quote, is heading, and with their policy, political strategies and methods. And then a link to ecocide law. Do you have any thoughts about that, Charlotte?
I haven't fully disentangled that for myself. My immediate hunch to that would be ecocide is an interesting lens and one that really from which we can learn and vice versa. So the ecocide mock trial, which I mentioned before, for example, there, by the way, that's really interesting because fossil fuel representatives were actually present at that trial. So that's an interesting example of maybe new mechanisms actually working out where transitional justice tribunals bring together perpetrators and victims. Leaving that aside, there's a certain danger, in my opinion, that animals are seen as masses, like a impersonal mass, like the environment usually is considered. Just nature seems impersonal out there, has no face, right? And so the danger with ecocide, in my opinion, is the same, is that animals are seen as a mass against that. Of course, we can injure and violate as well, but the faces are not there, and the interpersonal harm and the fact that they're agents is not being recognized. So these personal and agential moments, I think, are really interesting, and this is why this exclusive lens on animal studies is so interesting, for me at least, about the transitional interspecies justice lens.
Thank you. Will?
I just one question about ecocide that's come up, and I think it raises a broader question about the role of criminal law. I mean, it's essentially an attempt to criminalize certain kinds of harms and wrongs, and I think there's an interesting debate amongst progressive animal law people about whether, in thinking about things like transitional justice and transformative justice, whether to what extent criminal law in particular is the right vehicle, and particularly here in North America, there's this sort of growing anxiety about the way in which some animal advocates have become perhaps unwittingly allies of the carceral state. And so there's a kind of growing interest in whether we can find mechanisms other than the criminal law, but that would still be effective in preventing some of these harms and wrongs.
Yes, perhaps some of the ideas of Pachamama and the sort of the Latin American visions of restorative justice, often a different way of responding to both natural systems abuse, but also the animals within those systems. Paula, final question, I think. Paula Christina asks question, unfortunately, in many of our countries, the idea that justice towards animals does not respect or goes against cultural differences is growing. And she would like to hear your opinion on this matter of culture versus justice. Charlotte.
Yeah, a really important point, and in my opinion, ties into what Will just mentioned. It's all of these having animal rights on the backs of people and communities and groups who are disadvantaged for various reasons. Gendered, classist, racist, and other lenses that are being used. And I think that's not the way forward to advance animal rights, either in the transitional interspecies justice setting or any other setting. I think that's important to understand and to be attentive to those dimensions. Of course, we're not helping anyone, especially not the animals, if we say, for example, imagine a slaughterhouse, right? You have a slaughterhouse worker with a migration background, and they're being caught how they beat the animals. It's something that they're expected to do from a corporate policy that's unwritten just because the line moves faster. And so this person is being fired from this place. The corporation says it's not something that we endorse. We haven't observed that in the past. It's just a one case that happened, and it's not something that's structural in our company. And so this person gets punished, and it doesn't really help the animals, because it is a systemic issue, and it happens precisely because these people are already in a disadvantaged position, because they don't lack the financial means, the job opportunities to look for something else. They're at the receiving end from a wage perspective, and they don't live in a state that actually helps them if they lack a job, for example. So these are all dimensions of justice and injustice, where things like these come together. And so that's really important to acknowledge. And I think the cultural one is one as well that plays a role in this respect. So something I think any project in the animal studies area should be attentive to.
Will.
No, Charlotte said what I would have said. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Well, we very much appreciate everybody who showed and spoke today for the Tom Regan Memorial Lecture. I think he would have been fascinated and stimulated to hear the extension of animal rights theory into such really, really provocative and interesting areas. Without more ado, I wish you all a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening, wherever you may be in the world. And thank you very much for attending this lecture.
The Culture and Animals Foundation. Think, create, explore, celebrate.